Hello, my name is Johanna Reese and my presentation is on the reserve for the Cherokee known as 8 Killer, which is a title. It was to indicate his military status. 8 Killer in Cherokee is Chanel Dehe, and we're going to look at him in just a moment.
This PowerPoint presentation is about the 8 Killer Reserve on the Fiery Gizzard and was presented for class with Dr. Dennis Edgell. This is a poster that I created for the project and the 8 Killer Reserve on the Fiery Gizzard. This poster was intended to be used at the PERC Symposium that we didn't get to have, but hopefully we'll be able to do it and enjoy again. And that's presented through the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. And it is my hope that while I talk you through the process of how I worked on this project, you'll understand why I'm confident that I succeeded in meeting my goal. We set this goal before we did any research at the beginning of the course, and I do believe that I was able to succeed in what I set out to accomplish. Now, the land that I was researching has an oral history where the local folks have told stories about this and handed that down through time. But due to the vagaries of time, the evidence for the location wasn't available, even though these stories existed. Now, the land itself is quite beautiful, and the area around here, and the locals tell me, was 8 Killers Reserve. Parts of it are owned privately and parts are owned by the state. But the whole area is used through a gentleman's agreement between the two by avid hikers. And I myself have walked its trails and played in its waters many times. If you've never been there, I recommend that you go see it at least once in your life. This location is in Middle Tennessee. It is quite beautiful. In fact, this hiking trail is called the Fiery Gizzard Hiking Trail, and it is listed, I'm not sure what the placement, but it's in the top 25 best hiking trails in North America. So some of them are really arduous, but some are really simple to walk, and so there's something there for everyone. Now, to show you how confident I am that this is his land, I took a lot of time in looking at different things, not just what's there now, but going back in time. And for that, you really kind of need a little history. Now, the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes were under pressure to leave their ancient homelands and go west. They did not do this willingly, and many of the people were desperate to remain in their ancient homeland, and some of them, in an effort to buy time to try to find any other way to stay, they signed this treaty. Now, this treaty was supposedly going to allow them to stay in their homeland for the remainder of their lifetime and to allow their spouse and family to be there, but it wasn't going to pass the land owned, so it was just a stopgap measure. And sadly, it didn't even work for what it had been intended for in that situation. As telling them that they could stay there for their lifetime is not what happened. Despite the promises that were made otherwise, many of these people were chased from the reserve of land that they had been promised and that they had given up a lot in order to retain. Now, the important thing to remember is that the reserves themselves, because of this treaty, were extremely well documented. Even though it became a broken treaty, it documented a lot of the features of the land. Now, many of the reserve records remain on file in surrounding counties and states, and these were surveyed carefully, and they were referred to in later deed transfers as the property changed hands over time. Now, those are easily located, and this helps us to find the location of other places because these are documented. Other places that didn't get preserved in the later records can still be located. Now, how we do that, we take the well-documented and preserved treaty first and read that, because that'll make it possible for us to make sure of each reserve where it was located. So there's a story that 8 Killer had this reserve, and I was able to find not only his signature on the treaty, his mark where he signed it, but also descriptions telling where his land was. There's hundreds of these reserves, and I really only took time to look at about 23 of them to see how they were described. Now, the reason I picked these is because I could find something today that referred back. You could follow the progression and you could go back to the original survey. And those 23 allowed me to check to see how accurately the original one was done. Does it match what's been passed down? And they do match. That was important to know. It's easy to extrapolate from what is heavily recorded on down to what has been scantily preserved. And there's a lot of things in the descriptions that help us. We know these were squares, except when there were geological features that got in the way and it couldn't be an exact square, but we know these were squares. We know a lot of details because of these records. Now, all of the reserves were recorded in extreme detail with notes, measurements, and boundary markers. Now, over time, land changes, topography changes. It made it more difficult to keep track of a few of the reserves, but many of them, like I said, I found at least 23 that match still today what was recorded then. And the detailed notes of that 1817 treaty can still help us to locate those few that were not able to have that continuous provenance that we could follow through. Now, when the land transferred later, the deeds of the time referred back to the same characteristics that were noted in the original survey and treaty. In 8 Killer's case, we know it was the fiery gizzard, but in other ones, we have extremely detailed records of where they are. So we can use those records from 1817 up through 1819 when they were surveying to find where the property is today. And I used Marion County as an example because that was closest to where 8 Killer was, and it also had some very famous Cherokee who had their land recorded there, and their deeds are still on file in that area. So that was really important for me to be able to do this process. Marion County also, part of the land that used to be Marion County became Grundy County, and Grundy County is where Fiery Gizzard is today, but at one time it was in Marion County, and before that it was in the Cherokee Nation. One of the features that is detailed in the land of 8 Killer or Chanel Dehe was a water feature, and that was named the Fiery Gizzard. Now I'm told that's a Scottish term. I haven't been able to document that. That's oral history. Fiery Gizzard is referring to how the two streams come together in a convergence. Fiery because you can't really ride a raft quietly down the stream. It's a little bit too rapidy for that, and you can tell that from some of these pictures. Now we do know that water features are problematic for deeds. Over time, the water in streams and even lakes can gradually move, change location. But here we're lucky out a little bit. The gorge that the Fiery Gizzard runs through is a limestone gorge. Now that is soft rock, so it could still move, but it's still rock. And while that has minimized the distance the water can change its route, we also know that it's a big gorge. It's a deep gorge, so you can see where the route was by the way the stone has recorded the movement of the water. Now, even though that slight change is there, we still have to take that into account. And so that's why the records are very important. Now, to do this study, I looked at a lot of maps. There's a map that shows where the land was taken away from the Cherokee and chopped up away and what time that was. That's the Royce map, which is really good. It was done after the fact, so you've got to understand that it wasn't recorded at the time of the sessions. I think it was 1884 when this map was made, and it was going back all the way back to the 1800s. So you have to take that into account as well. There were a lot of other maps that we looked at when I went to the archives. They helped me, and I saw maps of Tennessee of all different kinds, and you can compare these to even more detailed maps where you can see the location on these maps. The problem was they don't all match up, and I needed to make sure they matched up. And I didn't want to print them all out and cut them with scissors or something like that, but it became obvious I needed to use the ArcGIS system that I had used in previous classes that I had learned about, and that helped me to match up the features and to be much more accurate. And even though the maps themselves are different maps, that ArcGIS, you can use that online. There's training. If you have never used it, you can learn how, and it can do thousands of things more than what I used it for in this project, but it was certainly helpful in this. Now, after that, I needed to use some math that surveyors use as trigonometry, which has been around for goodness, at least 125 years before the Christian era. And my surveyor uncle explained to me that it's used everywhere by every deed that exists. In fact, a surveyor that recently came and did the property I'm at right now, he was able to show me that that is used today even. Now, the notes that I used to find the written descriptions often contained not to scale drawings, but those are not the only thing you can rely on because they did actual survey maps later. But in the descriptions, they actually drew so you get an idea of the shape. So even in the written descriptions, which I relied the most on, the written descriptions were what I kept really going back to. Some are easily found. Others took a lot of digging. They weren't yet transcribed. I ended up transcribing a lot of records myself, and this was an obstacle I had to overcome. But as you can see, the detail of these records, this is a really good one that you can look at and see how detailed it is. Some aren't as easy to read as this, but this one was easy to read. Now, from that, we can derive a lot of information that we can then take online to the counties that have their records digitized. Marion County, Tennessee does have a plot map that is digitized, so you can look at that and you can see those records as they went and changed over time from that time period today. Kind of like when you put a puzzle together. If you've ever put a puzzle together, I could use that as an analogy to compare working in a puzzle. You start with what is known and you complete it by putting the edges together first, and you work in to finish the puzzle. So even if a piece is missing at the end, if all the other pieces are in place, you know what that piece looked like. And once you've completed all the sides, you can be 100% confident that even if the final piece is missing, you still know the shape of it by what was around it. And that's what we did with 8 Killer's Land. So we might not have his piece, his deed, but we can look at this puzzle and we know exactly what was the shape of his property. Now, this is not a square, but his was a square. And you'll know what that piece will look like based on what the other sides are. Now, I found all the reserves well documented on all 4 of his sides. Now, 3 of the 4 were mapped out and drawn out, and these records are on file with the state of Tennessee. Their descriptions in the treaty do match what was on the plot maps that I finally found, and you can use these detailed descriptions in the maps. Then I know that 8 Killers is going to match as well, and we can have confidence in that. Now, 8 Killers Reserve was described in, like I said, in that 1817 treaty. It was located on the Fiery Gizzard convergence of the Big Gizzard and the Small Gizzard. It was indeed in that exact location next to Susanna Lowry and the Cherokee named the Pigeon, and another reserve I found close by, John Walker's. Now, knowing this, we know where he was allowed to reside according to that treaty. And that makes a big difference in what we have been able to discover. So even though we couldn't find a picture of his deed that was marked out by the surveyor, we found maps of all the other surveyors. And so by placing them in place, we see the empty spot. We know where he was. Now, there was a lot to do with this. I used Fold 3. I went to local government websites. Fold 3 used to be called Footnote. I took some clip art from the internet that had the maps, even a map off of Wikipedia. There is a trail website for the South Cumberland, Tennessee South Cumberland Trail and the Fiery Gizzard Trail in Grundy County. ArcGIS, I totally recommend that. The Tennessee GenWeb has all of the reserves of that area have been thoroughly studied and the descriptions transcribed, so that was very helpful. I interviewed one of the genealogists and researchers that worked on that project. Tennessee has detailed maps, hundreds more than I needed for this project, and that's at the TEVA website. And of course, I used some of my images from Flickr. I really enjoyed doing this. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I've created a detailed blog that gives even more of the information that I had to skim over for the sake of brevity. If you are interested in the ArcGIS online, I hardly recommend it because it allows us to really explore the geography around us. Thank you. And again, I really enjoyed this and I hope you did too.